This presentation is on the Shafer Commission. This was a commission in the United States in the early 70s that was headed by Raymond Shafer. He was a Republican governor of Pennsylvania, and he submitted his report to the President of the United States, who was Richard Nixon at the time, in March of 1972. And I should say this is and was a report on marijuana and basically trying to get a resolution, get an idea of the laws regarding marijuana in the U.S. I'm using this U.S. Example. There was a commission here in Canada at the same time, the Ledane Commission. I have read that report as well. It seems to be more philosophical, and they really did not come to any conclusive conclusions. There were dissenting members of the commission that wrote separate reports, and it was, much more philosophical. It's very interesting to go over the Shafer report that most people have never heard of. Americans have never heard of. I'll go through the background of that. And it didn't shape the U.S. policy, but what came out, not because of the recommendations of this, but the political forces at the time and how laws around cannabis, marijuana came. So just a little background. So in the mid-60s, I'm saying American society, I'd almost say North American society, Canada being very so closely tied to the U.S. And they started wondering, okay, what the heck is going on and what was called the marijuana problem. And when you get something that becomes, say, a national problem, and so there was a lot of polarization between pro and anti, and a lot of the different factions. And of course, when that happens, people start to exaggerate claims. So it was really started to be, I guess, recognized as, in quotes, a problem. So it was also, so they had to say, okay, what's really going on? What is the question? And they're saying, why has it reached such a status in the public mind? Why is the public really saying, okay, I think we have a problem with cannabis, marijuana? And it had been used for centuries, as we know. And as the commission said at that time, it had been used in the U.S. for at least 75 years. But it really has not been in the past regarded as a problem. And it was just in the last decade, really the 60s and early 70s, starting to say, okay, what is really going on here? And in quotes, why is this now a problem? So when it came to the law, big thing is, at the time, it was against the law. But there was also inconsistency between what people were doing and the legal norm. So just because it's illegal and people are doing it doesn't really say we've got a big social problem. And it's been illegal for several decades, but there's also been violation of laws against gambling and adultery. And people haven't really not got up in arms like, oh my gosh, gambling's bad and adultery's bad, but suddenly in the spotlight was marijuana. And so that's where we really started to say, okay, why are we seeing this as such a problem? So with looking at the law at the time, alcohol in the 60s and 70s was legal, even though it had been proven that it was a danger to individuals and society's health. But no one really started saying, oh, we have a real alcohol problem. Maybe they were saying because marijuana being illegal, Didn't say that was really be the problem, but maybe it was. But then there was increased violation of the legal prescription, prohibition, doesn't actually explain the phenomenon. So the commissioner is really starting to say, okay, alcohol, we know it's a proven danger, but it's legal. People aren't getting upset with that. Marijuana is illegal, but more people are using it. But is that really saying why we have a problem? And I just put this little picture here that with our current situation, liquor stores and, as we know, cannabis stores are now considered an essential service. So you can go back to the commissioners who are saying, hey, alcohol is a proven danger to an individual and health, but it's legal, and now we're even at this time saying it's essential. So why are we saying marijuana is such a problem? So they started to try and figure out, okay, now, why is it? And they really started seeing that there were a lot of interrelated factors, and they saw 3 interrelated factors. The first, the illegal behavior is visible to all segments of society. There were a lot of concerts going on at the time, and cannabis was used very openly. And then secondly, they're saying it's perceived to threaten the health and morality, not just of the individual, but of society. How is it affecting society? They're really saying, okay, what's really going on? Is marijuana now affecting our whole society? And third, big thing, in the late 60s, early 70s, it was a symbol of wider public conflicts and issues. So 60s and 70s were times of a lot of protests, and a lot of protests on university, college campuses. A lot of protests against the Vietnam War, which was going on at the time. So here's from May 1970, and 7,000 arrested in a protest. So people were really starting to connect the two, saying, are we having all these protests due to marijuana? May sound a little crazy, but that was starting to be the thinking that, okay, we're having a whole lot of this, and it's causing a problem in our society. Is marijuana the problem? And if you talk to a lot of people at that time, they would say most definitely. So just a little history on the prohibition of cannabis. And as I said, for decades, it was confined. You didn't see it. And underprivileged social economic groups in our cities, and certain groups such as jazz musicians. This has come up a fair amount of times. Jazz musicians. What's this euphemism for? African American. That's really what it is. It instead of saying, well, it's an African American or black problem, let's just say jazz musicians, and everybody knows who we're talking about. So if they're there in the clubs, it's not seen too much. Well, who really cares about them? So saying we're not going to really care about that. And as long as it's confined to these groups, people didn't see it, most Americans and Canadians weren't really concerned. But in the mid-60s, everything changed. Big thing is middle and upper class college youth. And I would insert this in here. White. Suddenly, it's hitting the upper and middle class white families, and then they're saying, we've got a problem. And that's really when it started to hit the radar for a lot of people, when it was like, it's hitting suburbia. So what research had been done, there was starting to become some research done in laboratories. Whole thing is, whenever research is conducted in public, it's always not that good. One thing, if I'm reading a research paper or I'm reading something else, you go and say, okay, who funded this? And is it funding of an anti-marijuana group? Guess what? Their conclusions are going to be. And so you start to have very isolated findings, incomplete information, and then it was presented to the public. And really not trying to find out what the meanings were. Because yes, you can do research and design your research in a certain way to get the outcome that you want. And that was what was happening. Science, it became a weapon that say, well, this scientist at XYZ University came out with this study saying, oh, it causes all sorts of brain damage and causes people to do crazy things. And most people don't know how to read a scientific paper and actually go in and say, okay, what was your methodology? And can you really conclude what you can conclude from that? So you start to have anecdotal reports and limited populations. Surveys are really restricted. So when you're doing all this, you've got basically your research going on in a fishbowl. You are not getting accurate science. And that is something that you really have to have. You have to have independence of scientists. So independent of government, independent of companies. And that's where it's really good when you get funding bodies such as NSERC. And they will fund research, and your research is independent. Of course, prohibition. And it was propaganda. Started way back in the 30s. And a lot of it saying that it caused crime, insanity. I've always tried not to use this poster, but reefer madness, which actually really caught on, and how everybody's drug crazed. And so what it really was meant to do was to instill fear, and it really was a propaganda war. I could go into more of that. Hopefully you've gone into that in your evolution assignments, but really how a few well-connected, well-placed higher government officials really started to instill fear over this. And it really was, and this is what the commission was saying. This isn't not something I'm saying. This is right from the Shafer Commission in the early 70s, and they were saying it's mostly based on fantasy, not on proven fact. But these evils took root, and they're now coloring the public reaction to the marijuana phenomenon. So these are exact quotes out of the Shafer Commission. And they were really starting to say, okay, what we're actually seeing is not the true picture. So I don't think I need to say a lot more about this, but it is very true that if someone, and especially someone in authority, keeps repeating a statement in public, it assumes the status of fact, even though it's likely not fact. And as we know, this person likes to do that. So the commission, again, they start saying, okay, what are the threats to society? And they start to say, okay, why? And why does the public feel threatened? And so they're saying public safety, public health, big thing, social disorder. So 60s and 70s were real times of radical change, and people did not like, basically, and I would say this is the middle class saying, I don't like where our society's going. And then there were additional fears that it led to other drug use, which is LSD and heroin, calling it a gateway drug. So, and at the time, this is what the commission was saying. They were saying, what are the problems with it? That you're going to get idleness, lack of motivation, hedonism, sexual promiscuity. And because this is what was in the papers, and Woodstock had happened. So that's what the middle class society was seeing. And they were really saying, okay, this is a counterculture. This is not the North American society. And this really conflicts with my moral precepts. 60s, they really were a turbulent time, and it became the symbol for dissatisfaction. Kennedy was assassinated. The Cuban Missile Crisis, when Russia put missiles in Cuba, and that was a very, very serious time in our society. My father at the time was the superintendent of schools. He was telling me recently that he had a very concerned general from the Canadian Army call him up and basically go through the steps that he would have to document and what he would have to do, what he would have to put in place if there was a nuclear attack from Cuba. So it was a very turbulent, distressing time for a lot of people. And then they start seeing, okay, and now we've got marijuana thrown into all this. And it's appealing to our youth that our society is basically going down the drain. And there was a real general fear that there was a disintegration of the institutions. And it was really easy to say there was drugs and marijuana. And there were a lot of clashes between society and the younger society in America. You've likely heard Neil Young's song, Ohio. Does anybody really know what that means? What all of the words in Neil Young's Ohio means? So what I'd like you to do now is stop the video, go to Blackboard. I have a link there to the YouTube video, Kent State. And I'd like you to watch that. I will warn you, it is disturbing what happened. But that sort of puts into context what was happening in society at the time. That video always affects me. I remember seeing those pictures in the newspaper. As a 10-year-old, I couldn't figure it out. It was just simply, why are soldiers shooting students? And yeah, it was, that's why I think that affects me so much, that I remember it. Was just, it's awful what happened there. 2 of the students were part of the protest. 2 were just going between classes and got shot. It's just absolutely horrible. And actually, there's more shootings at campuses after that. So really wanted you to watch that to get a background on the disturbances in society at the time and where this commission was coming from. And the big thing is, going back to what the commission was talking about, yeah, that use of drugs is against the law, and then marijuana symbolized this disorder. And it's like, why is all this going on? Why are we having these protests? Aha. That's the reason why. And then, if you're really saying, okay, I really want to apply the law, what does that do? It just hardens views, either pro or against. And so marijuana, cannabis, really became a symbol. You had the peace sign. I remember that distinctly. And then also that cannabis as well. And so what the commission was saying, they're hopefully trying to clarify, what's the scientific evidence in there, and marijuana use. And so what they're trying to see, will this de-emphasize the problem? And what they wanted is rational decision making. That's what this commission, well, maybe it wasn't why it was formed, but yeah, I'll expand on that. Richard Nixon was a very hard right-wing Republican. This commission was made up of mostly Republican governors, police chiefs, very law and order people, and he expected this commission to come back with a document saying marijuana is terrible, let's keep it in Schedule 1 and really come down hard on it. The commission went off and said, oh, we're going to do our own work. And they did, and they really started saying, okay, how can we do this rationally and apoliticize it? So, historical perspective. So you had prohibition of alcohol starting back in 1870. And so then, back then, it was the liquor problem. And I really like this quote from the Anti-Saloon League, whereas liquor is responsible for 19% of divorces, 25% of poverty, 25% of insanity, 37% of pauperism, 45% of child desertion, and 50% of crime. Wow, it's responsible for more than 100% of all the problems in society. And so at that time, drinking, that was the problem. But you get to the 1930s, and this thrust against alcohol and tobacco had really diminished. And so the state and federal governments, they said, okay, let's regulate distribution, and the big thing, let's get some revenue from this. So at the end of the 30s, people said no. They don't see most don't see alcohol and tobacco as social problems. But I forgot to say again, these are exact quotes out of the Shafer Commission. And the big thing is, alcohol and tobacco, they had found social legitimacy, even though before it was recognized as a problem. So early use, if you're going back to the 1900s, only a few states regulated narcotic drugs. But more people were actually addicted to these drugs at the time than at any time since. And estimates were saying about 1 million people, 250,000 people, at least 1%. And at that time, in the 1900s, it was more females than males, more whites than blacks, and predominantly middle class. Basically, at the time, prescription drugs. And because there was so little regulation at the time. And a lot of this addiction was accidental. That people really didn't know what they're taking, and then it was well hidden. And over medication, careless, and repeated refills. So society really responded to this in indirect, informal ways, and there was self-regulation by the medical profession. The pharmacy industry started to put in regulations, and then labeling by the federal government in 1906, so people actually knew what they were taking, so they could start to stop this accidental drug addiction. So around this time, late 19th, early 20th century, they started to see that there was, a pleasure or street use of drugs by ethnic minorities. Society reacted to this problem by having criminal legislation prohibiting non-medical production, distribution, or consumption of these drugs. Big thing, difference between narcotics legislation and the temperance movement. Temperance movement, it was a lot of public debate. There was debate in public about this. Narcotics movement was not. Laws were made, and that was it. And temperance was very highly organized. There were a lot of temperance leagues. I live in Font Hill, and just down Effingham, there's a town. It used to be called Temperanceville. So it was very much organized, whereas narcotics, mostly ad hoc. And temperance, really to the public misconception, it really was not a lot about restricting private activity. What a lot of the temperance leagues were against were what was going on in saloons. And whereas narcotics said, that's it. None, period. And so then it's about acceptance. So it was like you had, as they say, two minds between alcohol and tobacco and, in quotes, narcotics. It really, the use of alcohol and tobacco was common practice. And so no one saw it as a problem. But big thing is the use of, in quotes again, narcotics was not native, and it was seen to be alien, like Chinese opium smokers. Just like Mr. Trump tried to call the corona virus the Chinese virus. Luckily, we have a free press that really had a lot of pushback on that, because it's very easy to target smaller ethnic groups. And so that's really, they were seeing as more marginalized members. So it was really what they were saying, and this is a quote again, what their narcotics legislation, it had to remove because it was cancer on the whole social organism. You had the Harrison Act back in 1914, and trying to control cannabis, and again, it was Mexican, West Indian sailors, and so they're really saying that, okay, this is really a minority problem. And when it started to become into middle class, as I mentioned before, that's when it really hit. And so there was a response to it, and it was a different response than alcohol and tobacco. And even as this commission stated, it was called a narcotic drug, and which is incorrect. By 1931, all but two states, they had enacted legislation against the use of cannabis. But not once during this period was there actually any serious, comprehensive, serious study to understand marijuana or its effect. It was very much a knee-jerk reaction and very, very, very politically driven. So, and it was assumed that it would make you crazy. There'd be violent crime and insanity. And there was very little on the official side to counteract any of this. So, people became felons because you had penalties for, in quotes again, narcotics. And so the penalties went up substantially in the 1950s. And so until a first offense for possession could be a felon subject to lengthy incarceration, just for possession of. In Florida, this is still current legislation today. Possessing 20 or fewer grams. It's a first-degree misdemeanor, punishable up to 1 year in jail. More than 20 grams. It's a third-degree felony. Third-degree felony, up to 5 years in prison for having 20 grams. Approximately 28 grams are in an ounce. You have an ounce, you could realistically go to jail for 5 years in Florida. And it goes up if you're doing sales or manufacturing. Again, a third-degree felony. And then if it happens to be within 1,000 feet of a school, place of worship, public housing, assisted living, punishable up to 15 years in prison. So the penalties went up, 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 and some are still on the books. You had and have the war on drugs. And I grew up during this era of the war on drugs and the way it was sold. I thought it was all about going after Pablo Escobar in Colombia and going against all the cocaine that was coming out of Colombia, and that because that's what was shown on TV, and trying to get these big drug lords. But it was really waged against communities of color, and they tended to receive higher offenses. I can't emphasize that enough, that like I say, I grew up on this, and the war on drugs, if it was on TV and they're having it, what did they show? Pablo Escobar, cocaine factories, labs in the jungle in Colombia. Didn't really mention too much about what was actually going on the ground. And it's say African Americans, 14% of regular drug users, 37% of those arrested. And from 1980 to 2007, 1 in 3 of the 25 million arrests for drugs was African American. And African Americans do not make up 1/3 of the population of the U.S. This was very interesting. I remember watching this on TV, and they were talking about how important this was going to be. When Florida, this was just last year, Florida restores voting rights to 1 million felons. And felons, as I pointed out before, that you can have felony for simple possession of cannabis. And 64% agreed to restore their voting rights to felons who fulfill their sentence, pay their fines, probation, parole, and they will be allowed to vote. But anyone convicted of murder, sex offenses would not. We have to recognize the war on drugs was really a lot about voter suppression. A lot of minorities, people of color, tend to vote Democrat. The war on drugs was brought in by Republicans. And again, I'll say, growing up and through this war on drugs and seeing on TV thinking, well, it's about Pablo Escobar. No, it was mostly about voter suppression. So, back to the commission. So, this commission, really, it was a very good commission. And they said, get rid of your preconceptions. Let's really go in and see what this problem really is. And they also said, okay, we hope our conclusions will be acceptable. They hope at least that the areas of disagreement, implications be brought into sharper focus. They were saying, let's look at this logically, scientifically. Is there actually a problem? I always love this quote. Be very, very careful what you put in that head of yours, because you will never, ever get it out. You get preconceptions. Someone tells you something is bad. Back to that war on drugs. When someone talks about war on drugs, I see the helicopters in Colombia. That is what I see. So it's really, and they're saying too, okay, you've had preconceptions about cannabis. Let's not have those and start with a fresh slate. With the U.S., it's very, very much about individual liberties versus a need for reasonable societal restraints. That is where Canada and the U.S. tend to differ very, very much about the rights of the individuals, less about society as a whole. Just last week, Donald Trump was talking about, is the cure worse than the problem? Meaning, should we really have social distancing? Let's get companies back working. He wanted to see full churches at Easter, April 12th. And it was about the individual going back to work, getting the economy going. He has certainly changed his tune now, because started to see that this social distancing infringing on the rights of individuals is better for society as a whole. Canadians, we tend to accept that more. We also have lower infection rates of the coronavirus because we are much more willing to listen to our government and to say, okay, this is better for society as a whole and not so much as the individual. You can also see that there are people, they call them convicts, who figure their rights are better than everybody else and are still going to parks and gathering. And finally, the message is going through to that. But it was really, again, with this, they were starting with this commission saying, okay, what about the rights of the individual compared to the whole societal restraints? And they're saying it's easy to go too far in either direction. And again, it was very evident as far as drugs were concerned, they're bad. It's mostly minorities. Let's just stop them dead. And this is the commission saying the use of drugs itself is not an irresponsible act, which I found pretty surprising from a fairly right-wing Republican commission in the 1970s. And as they're saying, medical and scientific uses serve important individual and social needs and are essential to our physical and mental well-being. What was declared an essential service in Ontario? Liquor stores and cannabis stores. And they're saying the use of drugs for pleasure is not inherently irresponsible. Alcohol, it's widely used and accepted. And, as they say, drugs should be our servants, of course, and not our masters. And when they become masters, then they dominate an individual's existence. Again, a direct quote from the Commission. We have little doubt that the substantial majority of users under any social control policy, including the existing system, do not and would not engage in irresponsible behavior. What they're really trying to say is, let's get this reefer madness belief out of everybody's head and say, look at, people are going to be responsible. So then they start to say, okay, what do we do? What policy are we going to have? And so they want to consider these policy options. Number one, do they outright approve it? Or do they outright eliminate it? Or discourage it? Or they say, we're just going to be neutral and not really have an opinion. And then the Commission went through all and they said, okay, are we going to approve it? And they came back and they said no, that they should not approve or encourage it. What they felt was official approval would inevitably encourage some people to use the drug who would not otherwise do so. And they say some. They're not saying all, but some. And then they said it would likely or could increase the incidence. They actually say would increase the incidence of heavy or otherwise use. So fairly quickly, they rejected approval. Elimination. And they were saying for half a century, the official policy has not been able to discourage it. So how do we eliminate it? And if you're trying to eliminate it, this is law enforcement. And it really reached its peak back in the 50s and 60s, and a lot of arrests going on in the 50s and 60s, and they say it was a greatly exaggerated concept of the drug's effect. So they're saying, look at, there's been an overreaction to cannabis. So in 1972, what they were saying, the information available to them, and they're saying marijuana is not adequately distinguished from other drug problems and was assumed to be as harmful of others. Think helicopters in Colombia and the cocaine coming in, and that was not differentiated from marijuana. So they were saying, based on studies of law, public opinions, that officialdom and the public are no longer punitive against marijuana use as they once were. They're starting to see that no, it's not tearing up society. And at the time in the late 60s, early 70s, there was actually a decline in the severity of the response to offenders. And it was very haphazard. You'd have some arrests on the street, in a park, in a car, and of those arrested, 50% of the adults and 70% of the juveniles were not processed. They basically said this is not worth going through and really not worth someone getting a criminal record for. And this is in the late 60s and 70s. Less than 6% of those apprehended are incarcerated, and very few of the sentences are for simple possession. So, law enforcement, they recognize that elimination is impossible at this time. So, and they were saying the attempts to suppress all marijuana use been replaced by an effort to just let's keep it in reasonable bounds. Okay? Let's actually think about this and have it reasonable. And they were saying that yet, because this policy still reflects a view that marijuana smoking is itself destructive enough to justify punitive action against the user, we believe it is not. What I'd say is an inappropriate society response. They were saying to have a lot of law enforcement putting more laws, trying to eliminate it, this is not the right response. The harm that it actually do does not justify such a policy and firmly punish those who use it. Basically saying, look it's not harmful. Why are we spending so many resources on this, and what is the point of putting someone in prison simply because they're using cannabis? And they're saying it's consistent, the estimate by law enforcement, that the elimination of use is unattainable. There were police chiefs on this commission. They were saying, look, we're not going to be able to eliminate it. It's just not attainable. So, prohibition. They were concerned about the evils of excess use of alcohol. Possession for personal use was never outlawed federally, and it was only illegal in 5 states. So, what this commission was saying is, well, they're saying that the moral contempt that some citizens hold of the marijuana user, what they're seeing in the newspapers, on TV, is related to behavior or other attitudes just assumed to be associated with this drug. In the 60s and 70s, this became well known, the silent majority. And what this was is saying that basically a lot of the middle class who are not outspoken, and you had this silent majority, and this is what Nixon really played to. But they were saying, look, the views of the silent majority actually aren't accurate. And they're also saying the moral views of the majority of marijuana users basically fit with that of society. Again, this commission was saying, look, what you're thinking of the marijuana user is not right. The marijuana user is regular Joe. So, what they said, they rejected the elimination policy. They said, if this is taken seriously, great increase in manpower and resources in order to eliminate the use of the drug, and it does not warrant that kind of attention. This is the report that was put out in 1972, and they were saying you're going to have massive amount of manpower, resources, courts, prisons, and all that. Guess what happened? The exact opposite. What was enacted was the war on drugs. And what happened? Huge amount of manpower, policing, courts, resources, prisons, and in the U.S., a lot of privately own prisons, and they're saying of the 8.2 million marijuana arrests in 2001, 2010, almost 90% were simply just for having it. Again, this war on drugs, it wasn't targeting Escobar. It partly was. It was mostly targeting racially. I'm trying to think of the word, marginalized society, and using it also for voter support. So then they start saying, okay, do we discourage or are we neutral? Should they just try to dissuade people from using it? So what they were saying, they're saying we must choose between policies of discouraging it or neutral. This came up more than once in this commission. They're saying it's a fad. Come on. Got our baby boomers, and it's a fad. It's going to recede in time. Do we really need to worry about this? And present data suggests this is the case, and they prefer that outcome, that it's just going to fade. It's a fad, just like bell bottoms, and it'll go away. I think we all know that didn't happen. So, one of their conclusions was, for this reason, we recommend to the public and its policymakers a social control policy seeking to discourage marijuana use while concentrating primarily on the heavy and very heavy use. With the discouragement policy, the commissioner said this is a real social policy, and it doesn't automatically mean there needs to be legal laws, basically laws put in place. So this can be more policy, but it doesn't necessarily say new laws have to be put in place. The commissioners were talking quite a bit about cannabis use among the youth. And the whole thing, what they were talking about is, if they're saying there's the hypothesis of widespread irresponsibility would attend freer availability of marijuana, suggests not that a restrictive policy is in order, but rather basic premise of our free societies in doubt, again, the rights of the individuals. So they said again, we do feel the threat of excessive use is most potent with the young. So that's why they were saying we think that all drug use should be continued to be discouraged among the young. And that's really what Canada's approach was, that they're saying, okay, let's regulate it and educate and trying to keep it out of the hands of the youth and profits out of the hands of criminals. So the commissioner said, okay, if we're having these responses, how do they do it? You know, do they come along and say they totally prohibit it, partially prohibit it, or regulate it? Total prohibition, which was basically in force at that time, and they're saying 11 states and District of Columbia simply being present in a place where marijuana is present is also prohibited. And even possession of the pipes or other paraphernalia is illegal. You ever watch the show Cops, and they're pulling over someone and they find cannabis hash pipe? Boom, you're off to jail. And they said the key feature of total prohibition approach is that even possession of a small amount in your own home for personal use is prohibited by law. And so they were saying they want to is this really the best way to discourage use, or whether it facilitates concentration on the reduction of irresponsible use. And they say that prohibition frustrates both of these uses, that it's not going to discourage use or irresponsible use. It's just going to go underground. And so then application of criminal law to private possession, philosophically inappropriate. So they said that if you're using the club of criminal law, it's too harsh of a tool for personal possession. Again, the rights of the individuals. It implies an overwhelming indictment of the behavior which we believe is not appropriate, saying don't use a big stick to kill a fly. The actual potential harm of use of the drug is not great enough to justify intrusion by the criminal law into private behavior. And they really say they really want to stop that. Government does not have any place in the bedrooms of the community, attributed to Justin's father. And the U.S. is very much about the Constitution. They believe, this commission, that government show a compelling reason to justify invasion of the home in order to prevent personal use. My home, my castle. And we find little in marijuana's effect or its social impact to support such a determination of going into a home in order to arrest someone simply for possession. So the enacting prohibition did not have a compelling reason 40 years ago, and this is 1972. They don't find a compelling reason for marijuana today. And they basically say it's functionally inappropriate, quite simply saying it's not going to work. And so what they said, it's the big thing is it costs far too much to do something like this, and contributes very little to the social policy. That if you're going to come in and go with prohibition and the possibility of criminal persecution deters users who are experiencing medical conditions. That's how we actually got our MMAR originally. Terry Parker, he could not access cannabis legally for his medical conditions. And if it's illegal possession, it creates difficulties in achieving open, honest education programs both in school and home. That it's illegal, you cannot have any education on it. And so they're saying if you prohibit it, you're not going to have education. So what they really said, let's have persuasion over prosecution, because they say possession offense really has very little benefit. And so what they really came down to is that, first off, you're going to have heavy social costs when you're putting a lot of people in prison, and you're going to get a lot of cynicism going on. So they're saying even under a policy of discouraging marijuana use, the better method is persuasion, education. It's all sounding pretty good. This guy still didn't listen. And what they said, additionally, with the sale and use of more hazardous drugs on the increase, violence escalating, we do not believe the criminal justice system can afford the time and cost of implementing the marijuana possession laws. Basically, concentrate on what's really a problem. More hazardous drugs, violent crimes. So they really rejected total prohibition and its variations. Don't clog the courts, don't clog the prison with people simple possession of cannabis. So they came to regulation. And so this, they say, institutionalizes the availability of the drug. And by establishing legitimate channel of supply distribution, society can theoretically control the quality and potency of the product. This is what Canada did. We developed a whole supply, the licensed producers, distribution, control quality. That's really the Canadian model. And as they said, we have given serious consideration to this set of alternative. However, we are unanimously of the opinion that such a scheme, no matter how tightly it might restrict consumption, is presently unacceptable. So they really decided against government coming in and saying, okay, let's regulate this like the tobacco industry. So, and what they're saying, if you start to regulate it, they're going to say this is going to signify approval. So, as he said, a tightly controlled regulatory scheme with limited distribution outlets, significant restraints on consumption, prohibition of advertising, compulsory labeling could symbolize such disapproval, which sounds like Canada did. It's almost two-pronged what happened with Canada. While we had 65% of the population in agreement with legalizing cannabis, we still had 35 to 40% against it. And you had to satisfy this proportion of the population, and by prohibiting advertising, very much having compulsory labeling, constrictive labeling. That satisfied a lot of people who said, okay, that sort of more or less is saying, yes, it's good, but discouraging it, just like the great big stop sign on THC on our labels. But they're also saying if you do regulate it, they're very much into this, would symbolize approval of use. And they're concerned that even neutrality towards use for matter policy could invest in otherwise transient, a fad, phenomenon with the status of acceptable behavior. So they were very, very close to saying we should regulate it, but we don't think this is going to fly because we don't want to come out and say, hey, we think this is. And again, the transient behavior. They believe marijuana in transit is transient and will diminish in time on its own accord. So they really thought it was a fad. And if we ignore it, it'll go away. So what they also said, if you have a regulatory scheme, you'd have create a significant public health problem, which seems a little strange because they acknowledged the society nonetheless chose to run such a risk in 1933 when prohibition was repealed. Alcohol use was already well established in society and no alternative remained other than the regulatory approach. In light of our suspicion that interest in marijuana is largely transient, it would be imprudent to run that risk today. So they actually thought you'd create a public health problem by regulating. So what they also said, the regulatory scheme would exacerbate social conflict and frustrate a de-emphasis policy. So they're really sort of saying, yes, it's okay, but I don't think we should do it. And as they said, a significant segment of the public on both sides of the issue view marijuana and its legalization highly symbolic. Like, hey, if it's legalized, we won. And on the other side, if it's legalized, the silent majority say our society's going down the drain. So, and they really thought it would be counterproductive at the time. And they also said there's not enough known about regulatory models in that area, because no one at the time had made it legal. And so they're saying, okay, should you go out and use the alcohol model in regulating cannabis? But they also said that can be you can't be so cursory. They said, we really want to know what's going to happen. And their quote, the regulatory approach which this nation has used in the cases of alcohol and tobacco have failed to accomplish two of the most important objectives, the minimalization of excessive use and the limitation of accessibility to young. I went to hear Anne McClellan speak. She was a former health minister, former deputy minister. She was co-chair of Canada's legalization task force, and she spoke at University of Waterloo on May 8th in 2017, and she said it as well, that alcohol was a failed health policy, and they did not want to go down that road again. And that's very much why it's very, very tightly regulated, because it's very hypocritical that if you're trying to buy a pre-rolled joint, I mean, it's practically impossible to get into the package, and there's so many warnings on it. But you could go to the liquor store and you could buy Hires Hard Root Beer, definitely appealing to youth, and you could buy massive amounts of alcohol that could easily kill yourself. So what they did was, with cannabis in Canada, really tried to go the other way, and very much trying to, while regulating it, almost trying to discourage it at the same time. So, do we partially prohibit it? So they say, okay, they're saying they're rejecting total prohibition because it's just going to clog up the justice system. They were of the unanimous opinion, and these are right-wing Republicans and police chiefs, and they said marijuana is not such a great problem. Individuals who smoke and possess it should not be subject to criminal procedures. So, but then they also rejected regulatory because they're saying you're going to institutionalize it and may basically say it's acceptable. So they said, okay, let's go part way. And if anybody's ever been on a committee, it's all about compromise. And they said, let's go partial. So they recommend this. So it symbolizes that, yeah, we're still discouraging the use, but you're also going to de-emphasize. Let's say they said, get away from saying marijuana is all these horrible things, and let's concentrate on, what are real societal problems. And you could permit medical, educational, religious, and parental efforts to concentrate, reduce irresponsible use. And they want to remove the criminal stigma and the threat of incarceration for widespread behavior. Really saying it's not a problem. Let's de-emphasize it. You can use it for medical. Let's teach about it. Let's have parents teach about it. Let's not stigmatize it and then really throw a whole bunch of people in prison over it, which we all know did not happen. Partial prohibition. So they said, let's relieve law enforcement of having to enforce this questionable law, and which you can't fully enforce. And now, okay, let's concentrate on the bigger boys, the drug traffickers, crimes against persons and property. I underline this because relieving the judicial calendar of a large volume of marijuana cases which delay the processing of more serious cases It's like there's more serious things to go on. So why clog it up with marijuana? It's almost a bit of a parallel with the COVID right now. Why are we doing social distancing? We want to stop the spread of this pandemic so that our medical system doesn't get overloaded. So with people who have heart attacks, car crashes, broken legs, they can be treated. Right now, if our hospital system is overloaded with people from COVID-19, how do we respond to our usual caseload? And they were saying the same, like, don't clog it up with cannabis. And here, 2001 to 2010, and this is US, in 2010, they made a cannabis bust about every 37 seconds. And you get all of these politicians tough on crime and such, and they can use it for real. So they suggested decriminalization. So you don't have to have a lot of change to the existing laws. And so they recommended decriminalization of possession for personal use at both the state and federal level. So what did they recommend? So marijuana in public, confiscated. Criminal sanctions would be withdrawn from private use, and possession incident to such use, such as but at the state level, would be fines for use in public. So no more criminal prosecution. It's confiscated, and it will be dealt with by using fines. So what did they recommend at the federal level? So possession for personal use, no longer an offense. Let that sink in. Federally in the US, possession for personal use would no longer be an offense. Possessed in public, subject to seizure. Casual distributions of small amounts for no remuneration. You grow some, you give it to your buddy. No longer an offense at the federal level. State, again, possession in private, personal use, no longer an offense. Distribution of small amounts, no remuneration, no offense. Public, 1 ounce or under, not be an offense, but it would be seized. More than an ounce, a fine of $100. A fine of $100. That's it. Distribution in public of small amounts for no remuneration, no profit, $100 fine. Public possession would be a criminal offense, public punishable by public use, not public possession, public use, $100 fine. Disorderly conduct in public would be a misdemeanor, 60 days in jail or a $100 fine. This is current Florida laws. What I have looked up that I found current. 20 grams or less is a misdemeanor, but incarceration up to a year and a $1,000 fine. 20 to 25 grams. It's now a felony. 5 years or $5,000. Less than 25 plants, a felony, 5 years. 25 to 300 plants, 15 years. If you're, and this is possession, within 1,000 feet of a school, it's a felony, punishable up to 15 years. That's what was recommended. This is what became reality. They were still very much against impaired driving, and it reflected that. Year in jail or $1,000 fine. So really still saying that no, we don't want anybody operating vehicles when impaired. So their final comment, the Commission feels that the decriminalization of possession of marijuana for personal use is socially self-defeating. Did I say decriminalization? It's criminalization. Feels that criminalization of possession is self-defeating. And they're saying, with all the social concerns in contemporary America, marijuana is not, in our judgment, ranked very high. He said, give me a break. We've got lots of things going on. We've got crime, we have domestic abuse, we have murders and such. And why are you going to put so many resources into cannabis? And they said they would de-emphasize marijuana as a problem. The result, Nixon was furious, absolutely furious about this report. And Shafer was supposed to become a federal judge. He lost that. This report was buried, and Nixon was going for re-election. And every week he came out with his war on drugs. Cannabis is a Schedule I drug, meaning it has no currently accepted medical use. High potential for abuse. It's in the same category as heroin, LSD. Schedule II drugs. Basically saying it's more dangerous than fentanyl, because fentanyl does have medical use, but it's a Schedule II. They're defined as drugs with high potential for abuse. And so this is cocaine, OxyContin, fentanyl are all in Schedule II, whereas cannabis is in Schedule I because they say it's extremely dangerous and has no medical use. This is what happened. He declared his war on drugs, even though around the same time the commission came in, and Nixon basically appointed the Shafer Commission to come back and say, man, oh man, you're right, Dickie, let's go and have the war on drugs. And what it really did, exactly what the commission said they shouldn't do. You're going to clog up the courts. You're going to clog up prison systems, incarcerate people for cannabis, and ruin lives for no reason. So 46 years after the Shafer Commission, Canada legalized. And cannabis is legal medically in 33 states now, recreationally in 11. It's still illegal federally. And I have read that if you have a Nexus card and you go for renewal and you admit to smoking cannabis, you could be denied your Nexus card. And because it's illegal federally. even though in 1972 the commission of more right-wing Republican and lawmakers said, don't do this. The U.S. is starting to change now, but it took so many years and ruined so many lives. So in summary, it's really amazing that this commission back in 1972 really came out with so many progressive recommendations, but strictly for political reasons, it was buried. Raymond Shafer had his career almost ruined and was denied his federal judgeship because, one, it looks good when you're trying to get elected, that you're tough on crime, the war on drugs, which was really a lot about voter suppression. And while this was U.S., it also influenced what happened in Canada as well. So it took so many years for all of this legalization and decriminalization to occur. So a nice little interesting wander down the historical path here, but I really find this fascinating, and it's almost like how much things have changed, but they could have changed so much back in 72 if Raymond Shafer, Richard Nixon, Raymond Shafer and his commission had been listened to.